All right, everyone. Take care of that. Today's workshop is going to be kind of divided into two parts. First part is really going to be focusing on this kind of introduction to the research process and some kind of key things to keep in mind when you're out there looking for sources. And then the last part of it is going to focus on actually finding sources using the LCC library databases and some other tools that are out there. So hopefully you're going to have some kind of knowledge from your notes and that kind of thing. You're also going to see some practical application of that knowledge in today's session. If there's any kinds of, I'll ask if you have topics that you're interested in working on right now, or you're working on in your classes, that we can kind of do quick searches and those kinds of things. So if you have any questions or anything like that, or anything comes up, you need me to slow down, you need me to repeat something, please go ahead and use the chat. Or you're welcome to jump off the microphone. Just be mindful, if we're in the middle of the presentation, chat's probably the easier option here. Okay, and we do have CC closed captioning enabled here, although it's not always the best when it comes to accuracy. If you don't know me, my name is Ching. I am an instructor here at Leeward Community College. I teach English 100, English 200, and the creative writing courses. That's typically 204, 207, and 211.
A little bit slow, please.
I will try. I do talk rather quickly, but I will try to slow that down. Okay, so a lot of my work does focus on research. I think it's just the idea there. All right, let's get started. Okay, so the research process. I think it's important to kind of start with the research process. So there are essentially 3 stages to the research process. So that means, when your professor first gives you an assignment, that's essentially kind of the initial research stage. But that initial research stage also is composed of a number of other things as well too, mainly gathering information and narrowing your scope. So when you first get an assignment from your professor, or perhaps like a position paper essay, and maybe you have a list of topics, or you have to find a topic that's right for the paper. Once you find that, your purpose at that particular stage of the research process is really to gather as much information as possible on the topic. You're trying to, in this initial research stage, become an expert on that topic. If you're researching, for example, should Hawaii raise the minimum wage? What you're trying to understand is not just how you feel about it, but all the various positions, all the various sides, the various impacts, indirect and direct, the causes of the problem itself, those kinds of things. So you're trying to gather as much information as possible. And through that process, you also want to be narrowing your scope down. So the scope is essentially, how large your focus of your paper is going to be, or how large your research is going to be. If you have a topic like the minimum wage, one way to go is, the federal minimum wage. Should we raise the federal minimum wage? You could focus that a little bit more, narrow it a little bit more, focusing specifically on the state level. Should Hawaii raise the minimum wage? And then from there, if you're doing like an argumentative paper, you focus it down even more. Eventually, after again learning about the issue, choosing your side or choosing your position on that particular topic. So that's what you're trying to do in that initial research stage: gather information, narrow your scope, so that you have a workable topic. If you're writing a 6-page paper on something like climate change is a huge topic. It encompasses so many different things, so many different areas. That's going to be too large for a paper of that size. That's why you really want to gather information, narrow that scope down. After you've sort of decided what your scope's going to be, decided where your sort of purpose is going to lie, then you enter the deeper research stage. So this is, you've got a sense of where you stand. You're trying to gather even more information to help develop your purpose, to help develop your thesis. If you're writing an argumentative paper, as most of you probably are, this is where you're trying to develop your position. You already have a sense of where you stand and the reasons for that. So now you're trying to gather as much evidence as possible to support that particular position, as well as get a sense of how you might respond to objections and those kinds of things as well too. And then we have the further research stage. This research stage is what I call the, oh dang it, I need to do more research stage, where you've probably at this point already outlined your draft, maybe even drafted your paper and gotten some feedback on it, and you realize there's some holes in my argument, there's some holes in my research that I need to go out and I need to find more research to sort of fill in those gaps. All right, so those are essentially the 3 stages of the research process. Before you start your research, some things that you should do and make sure you've done, as I mentioned, you should already have a viable subject or topic. Your professor probably would have provided this to you, or at least given you some guidance on this. So you do want to make sure you've got something that's pretty strong. Again, if you have a topic like climate change, maybe spending some time to narrow that down. And to do that, conducting some initial research to figure out, okay, what subtopic within that larger topic do you want to sort of focus in on? Once you have that, and I think for purposes of the examples, we're going to go with the federal minimum wage or the state minimum wage. So make that note to myself. After you've got that topic, I would suggest listing some questions. At this particular stage, the initial research stage, you're kind of in this beginner's mindset. So you want to harness that. You want to try to pretend you know nothing about this issue or this topic, and probably you don't, right? So go ahead and try to list all of the who, what, where, when, and why and how of that particular topic. What's the topic about? What are the sides? What are the effects? When did this start? How has it changed over time? Those kinds of questions. Just trying to come up with as many questions as you possibly can. Again, accessing that beginner's mindset. And this is really important because these are probably the questions that your audience, when you start to draft this paper, is going to have. So you want to make sure that you can answer those questions because you're probably going to be responsible for answering them in the actual document you're producing at the end of the research process. Also, make time to complete your research. I can tell you, I've been teaching at Leeward for about 9 years. The biggest thing that makes a difference when it comes to the success of a research paper is time management. Some folks think that if you've got 6 sources, you can find those 6 sources in a day or in just a couple of hours or the night before your annotated bibliography is due. No, to find 6 good quality sources, you're probably going to have to look through 25, 50 sources. It'll probably take you several hours just to find one good source. And that's why it is really important that when you first get that assignment, you pull out a date book or your planner, something on your phone if you're using your phone to manage your time, whatever it might be. And you're actually looking at, okay, your work schedule, your life schedule, and you're blocking off time to conduct your research that right, on this day, for this hour, I'm going to be looking for this source, and off you go. So really making sure you make time to complete your research and be practical and reasonable about that time as well too. Don't just think, I work 9 to 5 today. As soon as I get off, I'm going to do some research and then I'm going to go kind of do the rest of my homework and that kind of thing. Probably if you get off at 5 o'clock, you're going to need an hour to unwind. Probably need another 30 minutes to kind of veg out or talk to your family or whatever it might be. You got to take those things into account too. Don't try to cram everything in. Again, make time to complete that research. Also important, keep an open mind throughout. You might have chosen your topic because you feel a certain way about it or you feel drawn to it for whatever reason, but it is really important, especially in the initial research stage, that you try to separate yourself from that topic as much as possible. And that's really important so that you avoid things like confirmation bias. I've had situations where students have gone into a topic. One of the requirements of my courses is that you choose a topic that, yes, you're interested in, but you can remain objective about. It was clear that there was an issue with objectivity here, and that resulted in some problems later. Mainly that when this particular student ran into research that contradicted how they felt about it, they ignored that research. And so again, they ran into confirmation bias. So it is really important. Yes, you might feel a certain way, but when you run into that other source and it says something different, you've got to be able to separate yourself, read a little bit about it, get a sense of what's going on there. Right? And that's why, again, initial research stage, just trying to explore, just trying to make up your mind of where you want to be rather than trying to confirm your bias or your position already. Okay, and that you also keep track of your research using a research log. So a research log, this is essentially just a journal or a notebook or an open Word or Google document. It's really just a place where you're going to keep all of your research. Another issue that can kind of come up with research papers, and especially the drafting of research papers, is that folks oftentimes lose track of their sources. They forget where they got that quote from, or they can't find the website they had found 2 weeks ago. Right? And that creates all kinds of problems, stress, anxiety, that kind of thing. We want to avoid that. So we really want to, as soon as we start, researching and looking into our topic, we've got that document, we've got our notepad open, and we're keeping track of everything that we find. Okay. Some things to keep in mind, you can always add to your log. So, when you find a source that might be interesting, throw it in there, right? Put any notes into your notebook, whatever it might be. I'm going to kind of cover what kinds of things you can include in a few slides. But so you can always add to your log, but never throw away or delete any of your research. This is really important, especially because you might look at like 50 sources during that initial research stage. And then when you're in the second research stage, you might only find that you need 10 of those sources, right? You might think, oh, okay, I only need 10 of these, right? But when you're in that third research stage, remember that's the old, oh darn it, I need more research stage. That's when you might realize, oh no, I had this source, right? You can go back to your research log and you can pull that information rather than trying to go and find more information. You might already have it. So again, it kind of saves you time in that particular respect, rather than, you kind of think, oh, I don't need this, you dump it all. And then when you realize, oh no, I do actually need that source, right? You don't have to scramble to find it, it's already there. So again, always add to your log, never throw away or delete any of your research. And ultimately, the whole purpose of this, again, to keep you more organized, to help alleviate stress and anxiety, and also to help avoid plagiarism. Because the number one reason probably for what we call unintentional plagiarism is lack of time management. People copying and pasting sources into their document, forgetting where those sources came from, and then not citing them, mixing them up with, their own words, their own thoughts, right? This helps us to avoid that because this is from this source and you know how to cite that easily. Okay. When you're adding an entry to your research log, some things you should do first is skim the source and evaluate the quality of the source. Make sure it is a good source. We're going to talk about the CRAP test in a few slides. I would suggest after you've determined, yes, this could be a useful source for me, put the bibliographic information first. If you're using MLA format, I would put it in MLA format. If you're using APA for your science courses, use APA, whatever the formatting is. I'll cover some hacks for the bibliographic information when we're in the practical section of the presentation today. But have that information down, because that MLA in-text citation and works cited entry, that's also a thing that can cause us, just makes us pull out our hair right when we're drafting our paper. So getting that down automatically, putting it there for us saves us time in the long run. After you've skimmed it, you know the bibliographic information, then you want to go ahead, read and annotate. After you've taken some notes on it, you've done an initial reading there, go ahead and put in your research log a section like initial thoughts, and just write some things that came to mind when you first read this source, questions that maybe came up, key points or details that you were thinking about when you were reading it, maybe connections that you saw to other sources that you've already read. Okay. And then after you've read it that one time, go back. And so this is really important. Oftentimes people think, especially with research papers, that you can just kind of jump into the article and you can read that 30-page paper in half an hour. You can read it as fast as you do a Facebook post or an article that you found on social media. But in most cases, especially with research articles, that's not going to be the case. They can be dry, they can be long, they can be complicated, right? Which is why we want to give ourselves in our mind time to process. So read it, take down those initial thoughts and then return to it. Maybe even give yourself a 5 or 10 minute break before you return to it again. And that ensures that one, you're coming back to the reading with a little bit of a better sense of what that reading is about, so that when you read it that second time, you're able to take better notes. You're able to summarize sections you think might be useful when for your paper later on, or paraphrase sections that could possibly be used to support your points, or key quotes or details that really strike you in that particular section. And then after you've done that second reading, then go ahead and label another section, afterthoughts, or what do I think now? If you had questions at the end of your first reading, try to answer those questions now. Again, maybe try to take inventory of some of your annotations, look if there's a point that could be drawn between some of the key details that you noticed, right? Again, try to synthesize that information, try to make the most of this source already in this last section of it. And after you've done that, then move to your next source. And again, this helps to make sure that once you're done with your research and you start entering that second and that third research stages, right, we can make the most of our sources. We don't have to worry about how am I going to use this source, or what am I going to pull from the source. It's all right there for you. Now, most of you probably are using online articles and sources. I mean, that's what we're going to talk about today. So I would suggest using a double entry journal. I'm not that old, but back in my day, as they say, we had a lot of paper sources, and I'd go to the library and you'd pull books and that kind of thing. For the most part, everything is available online for you, especially here at Leeward. We have an extensive databases, extensive resources available to you. So a double entry journal is really a way to make the critical reading process physical when you're dealing with digital sources. So you can have a Google Doc that's divided. A Google Doc that is divided. You can put a table on one side, a table on the other side. You can mark that table from the text on the left and then from your mind on the right. I would say at the top, put the bibliographic information. So where double entry journal is here, put the bibliographic information of the text. And so again, when you're in that second reading, on the left-hand side, you can put those key details, and you know for yourself, because of the way it's sectioned off, that these are directly from the text. These are not your interpretations. These are quotes. These are key, details or facts. These are words that might be useful, concepts or ideas. And then on the right, you can paraphrase, you can connect them to other things, you can discuss them in relation to a point that you might bring up when you're discussing your position. Okay, but this again helps you to keep track and take notes of your sources when you're dealing with digital sources. Also helps you to inventory that as well too, if this works for you. A lot of my students use this when we're talking about it. It tends to be a really helpful strategy, especially again, dealing with electronic and digital sources. Okay. Okay, we're gonna move on to credible sources. I think we're doing pretty okay in time. Any questions on what we just discussed before we sort of discuss into what makes a source credible or how to evaluate a source? I guess we've covered the research process. Again, if you have a question, you can type it in the chat. I'll give you folks just a second here. Okay, not seeing anything yet. If I do see one pop up, I'll go ahead and answer it. Okay, so what's a credible source, right? It's kind of a question that oftentimes we have when we're approaching the research process. So I like to start with really what's not credible. So what are some sources that we think are not credible, or some things that make a source not credible? What can we really rule out right off the bat? What have you been told not to look at when you're doing research? Wikipedia. Thank you, Jamie. Why Wikipedia? Why is that not considered a good source? Why is it? Yeah. Anyone can edit it. Yeah, exactly. It's not credible because anyone can edit it. We live in the real world. You might find a Wikipedia article. You're not going to use that in your source. I do let folks know, if you do find your way to Wikipedia, you're not going to be able to cite that at any research paper at an academic level. But that might help you to sort of find other sources. You kind of scroll down to the section where, provides references, and that might take you to somewhere that might be credible, maybe. But generally, yeah, Wikipedia, not good. And I'll actually show you a reference source that you can use that's kind of better than Wikipedia, and it's more credible than Wikipedia. Okay, yeah, Wikipedia, not good. Some other sources that are not credible in an academic setting, typically. Personal interviews. Now, of course, if you're writing an ethnography or your professor is requiring you to conduct personal interviews, that's a different situation, and they might have processes associated with that. But generally, personal interviews cannot be verified, thus they cannot be used. Yes, you might know, the dean of students, or you might know this researcher out in the field. If you know that person, ask them, where would you send me to find this information? Or ask them, have you published anything that I can possibly use, rather than using a personal interview there. And again, that's because I can't verify the information. And if I can't verify it, neither can your audience. That creates a believability and a credibility problem for you. And what you're trying to do when you're conducting the research and you're gathering your sources here is you're really trying to build your credibility, right? Because you're coming to this paper with, to some degree, no credibility. And so when your audience is looking at you, they're looking at what sources are you using to build up your points and build up your ideas in that particular respect. Okay, and to prove your points. Articles with no citations or references. Again, this comes down with, can you verify the information? If you're reading an article and there's no links there, if there's no works cited or references page at the end, that's a problem. Where are they getting this information from? And sometimes, especially with some of the articles that we see out there today with divisive issues and that kind of thing, they're hoping to use emotional manipulation to get you to see past this lack of citations on these references, and that becomes a problem. And we kind of see this again, with a lot of things that are being spread on social media and that kind of thing. Personal blogs as well, a problem. Again, it's self-edited. Who's writing this? Where's the information coming from? And any self-published material. When in doubt, try to search or do a quick Google of the publisher or the author and see if they have any credibility outside of what you're reading. See what they've written in the past, see what that publisher is associated with, and you'll kind of get a sense of, if this is something that's kind of credible. Some things that are generally considered credible: peer-reviewed sources. You can find out if a source is peer-reviewed by going to the About Us section of a website and see if they note it. A lot of your science journals are peer-reviewed. I'm going to show you in the academic databases how to kind of make sure that a paper is peer-reviewed. But essentially what that means is that a group of experts have looked at this particular paper and they determined that the information is true, or as true as it can possibly be, whatever it is. Websites from credible institutions, places like Mayo Clinic, Department of Justice, state and city websites, UH Manoa, right? Those kinds of things. Things that are marked with .gov or .edu, generally credible, generally reliable. Articles with references. Of course, look at the references they're using. I mean, you might have a reference list there, but okay, we'll kind of talk about that as we go. And then books and magazines from reputable sources. And again, if you're not sure, do a quick Google to see, is this source credible when you're reading it. And we'll talk a little bit of the CRAP test. So what you can use is you can use a CRAP test. I mean, a lot of what we talked about is kind of just general rules of thumb. But a way to really ensure that a source is credible is to consider this criteria: currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose. So currency is timeliness. So when you're trying to determine whether or not a source is current enough, is timely enough, some questions that we can ask is, when was the source published or posted? Is it current enough for my subject, for my topic? Do the links on the website work? Are the sources that source is using current enough? And is it the newest edition? For most topics, what do you think is sort of the range? How old is too old for maybe a topic like climate change, for example, or sea level rise? We'll go to a more specific topic, sea level rise. What's the cutoff for you? When's a source too old? $6 years? That's pretty good. Do we agree 6 years? Older, more recent? What do you think? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think 6 years is pretty good. I mean, 5-6 years, you're pretty in a pretty good spot there. With science topics, math, I mean, even humanities topics too. I mean, things can change so quickly. But yeah, 5-6 years is probably pretty solid in that particular respect. Anything older than that, you might run into some issues in terms of how reliable the information that they're providing is. And that's why we really want to consider that as well. Of course, if you run into a source that's a little bit older, maybe it's providing a definition of something that really remains pretty static, you might still be able to use it, right? But consider, right, do you have a more current source here in that particular respect? So if it is a little bit older, maybe put it as kind of a source you might use. Maybe it's not your strongest source, but got some good information there. So maybe keep it on the side for just in case, right? And then kind of look for more information as you go. And that's the same thing for the sources that you're using. If you run into a source that was published last year, but they're using all sources that are 10 years old, that's a problem. What's the issue here in that particular respect, right? Do the links on the website work? This can also be a problem. They might link their sources, but if you click on that link and it takes you to a 404 error, or it creates a problem for you, the question that I would have is, okay, how often have they come back to this source? How recently has it been edited and updated and changed in that particular respect too? Because the source can be old, but it could also be edited as well recently to kind of keep it up to date in that particular respect. Okay, so some important questions to ask there. All right. And then we also come to relevance. So relevance is just thinking about how important or how relevant is this to your particular needs. So asking questions of, is it relevant to your topic? You might have read the little introduction and it sounded like it was relevant, but when you actually started to skim this source and get a sense of it, you realize, wow, only one paragraph is talking about my topic and the rest is related to something else entirely, right? Maybe you're dealing with sea level rise, you found the source, it mentioned sea level rise in the introduction, but when you get into it, it's just really talking about climate change in general. That's not really going to help you if you're dealing with a topic like sea level rise. So thinking about, okay, is this relevant? Is it not relevant? Also be thinking about, is there enough depth to that source? Again, your believability, the believability of the argument or the explanation or the analysis that you're putting forward is dependent on your sources. So we want to make sure that our sources are detailed, that our sources are using source material, right? That they would stand up in a college level class. You'd expect to read it at a college level. KHON article, I've got no problem with KHON generally, but 3 paragraphs on that topic, probably not going to be, it's a little bit too shallow for your purposes here. We want something a little bit more in depth there. So you want to be wary of that. If it's just 2 paragraphs, it's giving you some breaking news or something like that, yeah, that's not probably good here. You want to look something for a little more depth. Again, think about your audience. For most cases, if you're writing about it in college, you're writing for a college level audience, and that's what you should be expected to read and kind of bring into your paper. Also be thinking about, how does it rank in comparison to your other sources as well too. As you go from that first stage of the research process, the second stage of the research process, you're really going to have to start making decisions about what sources are going to be the best for the paper that you're trying to write. So if you continue to run into sources with the same information, or you run into sources that are essentially providing you with details you've got, I mean, thinking about, okay, do I need this or do I already have it? And starting to kind of eliminate those things as you go. And again, that's why it's really important that before you spend your time taking notes on it, you do skim it and you do evaluate it. So that within that 5 minutes, you can kind of get it out of the way. You're like, okay, I already got this information. There's nothing new here. Move on to the next source, right? That's why, again, making that time to do this is really important. It's not about the quantity of the sources. It's about the quality of the sources. If your professor tells you have to have a minimum of 6 sources, you might only need 6 sources if those are the best, highest quality, most credible sources you can find. And that's what they provide you. But in most cases, a professor tells you need a minimum of 6 sources, you're probably looking at around 10 to 12, because some of those sources are probably not going to be the best. But is it possible to write in less? Of course, absolutely. But the minimum is the minimum. I think that's, if you're looking at a C, then yes, that's probably your minimum. That's the threshold. But A, B papers are probably going to be bringing in more information in that particular respect. Okay, but again, you're going to have to be making those decisions. So also be thinking about that. You don't want to be spending your time looking at source material that you've already looked at. Okay, now we move on to the first A of the CRAP test. This is authority. So this is essentially asking questions about who is the source of this information, where is it coming from, who is the author or publisher, looking at their bio, right? If this is a science article, going down and seeing, are they from a science background? Do they cover science related topics? What's their relationship to the stuff that they're discussing? Because sometimes we run into an article, it sounds really great. We look at the bio, could be questionable there. Sometimes there is no bio, and that's also a problem. If you're not seeing contact information at the bottom, what's being hidden here? Why can't I contact the individual to make any kinds of corrections, that kind of stuff. When there's no author, no actual person that you kind of relate that back to, that's a little bit of an authority concern. Possibly. Okay, thinking about what their credentials are, how their credentials are relevant to it. And again, if it's peer reviewed, you can always find out going to the About Us section. You can also, go to quick Google, take the publisher's name or the journal's name, put peer review next to it, see what kind of pops up in that particular respect. Okay, and it's not to say that if a person, is not from a science background, they can't write about a science topic. I mean, that's unrealistic. But if they're not from a science background, that means that what they put into that paper, they better be sources that are scientific, that are factual, that are believable and credible. Right? Because if they're lacking in credibility, that means that the credibility that they're going to be putting forward needs to be from the sources. Okay, and then accuracy. So this is asking questions like, is the information well-reasoned? And is there credible support? So when we're talking about well-reasoned, it's objective as much as possible, and that when claims are made, they're supported by sources. Claims aren't just made, assumptions just aren't put forward, and there's no evidence there. There's got to be a link, there's got to be a source there to ensure that, okay, yeah, when they're saying that this is happening, that this is one benefit of whatever's trying to be pushed forward, there's a source there to back it up. Again, thinking about, this is an academic paper here. Is this something that's reliable in that particular respect? Does it have a reference list or a works cited page? We've kind of already talked about that, links to the sources. Another important one, can you access the original source? So oftentimes you might be reading a paper and you want to use it, but it's an indirect source. So you want to use like some stats, some statistics that they're citing. So that's what we call indirect, because you're not actually citing the source of the statistics, you're citing a source that's citing the statistics, right? So that's called an indirect source. So as much as possible, you want to try to scroll down to that reference source, go to the actual statistics themselves and see if the information lines up, because sometimes it doesn't. And you might ask, well, why would someone lie about that? Well, especially when you're dealing with divisive issues, which now in our current sort of culture, some of the most, you think, why that issue is not divisive, but it really can be. Right, so you want to make sure you verify it, because statistics can be misrepresented and that kind of thing. So trying to access the original, clicking on the link, see if you can get there. I had one situation, I've talked about this before, not in this particular session, but in past sessions, where a student wanted to use a particular study. And it caught my attention because for the most part, a lot of students who deal with similar topics and that kind of thing. And when you're working on research papers and that kind of stuff, you're familiar with a lot of topics that are out there. So when I saw this source, I was like, oh wow, that's really interesting. I've never seen this study before, and I've never seen these statistics before. And it was a really surprising. That kind of had my critical thinking hat sort of up, right, on rather, or had me on high alert. So I went to the source, did a quick Google of the source to find it. And then when I went there, the source did provide the information. It did have a link. I clicked on the link and it took me to a website for the educational institution that had published that particular study. However, right there on the front page of that study was a big box, and it said, this study has been retracted because the information has been misused or misrepresented by multiple sources. And so the study had been retracted, had been removed. Thus, there's an issue there, right? And there's an issue there all the way down the chain. So it is really important that you are accessing the original source material, because you don't want to run into that. I had another issue, same kind of situation. Source seemed really interesting, seemed really sort of kind of different. I hadn't seen that before. I clicked on it and the source was in another language. It was in German. And turns out that the information that was in that particular study was being misrepresented by the source. But because the source that was interpreting the information was for a Western audience, they probably were assuming that they weren't going to be able to access the original. They can misrepresent the data, right? And they've convinced you of something. And, again, this is kind of a little bit of a problem with the internet and with misinformation that's out there. But that's why it's important that for you, you're doing the work to make sure that you're coming into this and leaving it with a more well-rounded, well-reasoned sense of this particular issue. Okay, sorry, went on a real sort of tangent there. Does the information coincide with other sources? Again, that can be a little, not to say that all sources should align, but unless that source is pretty recent, if all of the sources from the last 5 years that you've been looking at have been saying the same thing, and then all of a sudden you run into a source that's published around the same time that's saying something completely different, again, that's going to have sort of my alert kind of icon above my head as I go. And I'm thinking, okay, what's going on here? Maybe I need to look a little bit more into this. Again, maybe it's something more new. Maybe it's something more recent. Maybe it's a different kind of study that's come out that's never been done before. Or maybe it's being misrepresented for some particular reason. Are there spelling or grammar errors? Does the author employ an academic tone? Okay, and then purpose, the last part. So thinking about, is it there to sell, persuade, explain, or inform? Being mindful that, again, .edus, .govs, generally credible. .orgs can be a little bit of a problem because those are organizational websites, and organizations can have particular biases or agendas. So you want to make sure you're doing a little bit of background research on the organization before you're deciding to use that particular source. And .coms, they can be okay. They're commercial sites. They might be there just to, like KHON or Roy News Now, whatever it might be, to sort of get the clicks. They're putting out the breaking information, but they're not necessarily doing in-depth reporting. Not to say that they can't, but just sort of thinking about that, keeping that in mind. So you do want to make sure if you've got a .com there, take a look, make sure it's current, make sure it's relevant, make sure it's got enough depth to it. Also be thinking about who created it. Is there contact information? Is the intent clear? Is there any information that's left out? Again, you're an expert. You're starting to become an expert in the initial research stage, and then as you enter the second research stage. So if you're starting to see that an author is putting forward an idea, maybe in an opinion piece, and they don't acknowledge the other sides, or they don't take into account objections that might come up, that probably means that the source is one-sided. Take it with a grain of salt when you're reading it. It might not be the most credible source, because you can use an opinion piece, to support your argument in a position paper, as long as that, opinion piece is well-reasoned, uses sources to do it and considers the other side to ensure that it's consistent and complete. Right? But again, if it's just one-sided, it's just one-sided, and that's not really helping you, because that source is probably a little more biased than you want to bring it into your page. Some things to sort of think about as we move into, we're going to move into the second stage of this particular presentation. Save yourself time. So again, keep track of your sources, whatever you decide to use, whether it's a research log like the ones we talked about at the beginning of the presentation, or it's something else. Keep track of the source information, bibliographic information, where you found it, essentially. Any quotes, make sure that as soon as you find it, you put it in quotation marks. You put the citation there so that you don't get confused between what's my words, what's the author's words. So keep in track of that. Follow the critical reading process. That's the process whereas you skim to get a sense of it. You go through the process, taking notes, writing down your initial thoughts, and then going back through and taking down those paraphrases and quotes and key ideas you might use. And then don't forget to evaluate, when you're evaluating your source, also take into consideration all aspects. So when we're talking about the CRAP test, just because something might be a little bit older or something might be, from a .org, doesn't necessarily mean it's off the bat a bad source. You've got to consider every single aspect of the CRAP test and take that into consideration, because we're looking for something that's more well-rounded in that particular respect. So just because it's a little older doesn't mean it's bad. But keep in mind, this is a little bit older, right? Have that in the back of your head as you go forward. All right, so now we're going to transition. We're going to move to the Leeward CC library, and we're actually going to lead this PowerPoint. So I'm going to pause the share. And as I do this, any questions, anything that came up as we were going through those slides? Again, I know we covered quite a bit. And I was mindful of my pace. I was trying to work slow, although I know I'm a talker. Anything that came up, anything that any clarity on or that you're thinking about? Okay, not seeing anything. Okay. Right. So you should be looking at the Leeward CC library website here. And I know we've got some folks that are from other institutions, WCC, HCC, KCC, possibly. And so keep in mind that for the most part, you probably have access to the same databases that I'm going to talk about here. I think there might be some slight differences between what certain libraries have access to. But of course, if you're a UHCC student, you should be able to access this library as well, regardless of your institution. Okay, so this is the Leeward CC library website. This is really the first place that you should start when you start your research process. Some people would start with Google, and I would say don't do that, because Google is going to provide you a lot of information, and you're going to have to be doing a lot more work to determine credibility when you're starting with Google. I like to save myself time. I like to start in a much more focused direction, and that's where I start here. But some people would start here. I would say, don't start there yet. Start right here. Now, when you click on that link, you're going to see these 7 databases that are here. If you click on this tool, it'll open up over 100 databases you can look at. These are the most popular. These are the most useful. These are probably the ones that the students use the most. If you're just trying to get a sense of the topic, as most of you are, when you're in that initial research stage, 2 particularly helpful sources. One's Credo reference. When you click on this source, it'll ask you to log in. I've already logged in preparation for this workshop to save us time. Okay, so Credo reference is like credible Wikipedia. So if I'm dealing with a topic like, I don't know, genetic modification. What this gives me when I type in that topic is it gives me a number of reference sources, encyclopedias, journals possibly, that'll give me kinds of definitions and histories. You'll have this key page up at the top. When you click on that, it gives you really just objective information, giving you an overview. Now, this is a little bit on the shallower side, not necessarily the best source there. But again, reading that might help you a little bit before moving on to some of these other sources. And I don't have this particular source I looked at, but you can see this a little bit, a little bit more in depth here. Let's give you a little bit of a greater sense of what genetic modification is all about, right? So again, this is credible here. It's coming from sources that are themselves credible. So if you want to learn a little bit about the topic before you start exploring, the databases, this is a good place to start with that. Another nice thing about it is right in that second slide I was talking about, before you start, your research, that initial research stage, you should try to create a list of keywords. And when you're using Credo reference, you'll notice this mind map on the side. It also gives you a number of keywords that you might use to help as you research more into this particular topic. And the great thing is you can, of course, click on them and they take you to other pages that are relevant to that particular topic. Okay, so that's Credo reference. And the great thing about these databases, I told you I would talk to you about some hacks for citation. You know, if you find a source, you're like, oh, this source could be good. And you remember, you can do your research log, you're gonna take your notes. First thing you should note is the bibliographic information. On all of the databases, you've got this citation tool up at the top. You can click that, click on the format that you're using, and then you've got your citation. So you just need to take that and format it into your works cited page or into your research log. But it's done a lot of the work for you. So there it is for you, okay, in that particular respect. You can also print it for yourself if you want to read it, you know, at work or in your car or on the bus, whatever it might be. You can share it with yourself too, if you want to do that. All right, let's go back. So that's Credo. If you're dealing with divisive issues, topics like that, issues and controversies and opposing viewpoints are also good choices. For the sake of time, I'm not going to get into these, but issues and controversies, this is essentially like a publication that provides a larger sense of what's going on with the issue. If you're looking at something like, again, the minimum wage, for example, I'll click on it, we'll take you there. We've got a minute. Wage. You'll find issues like, you'll find sources like, this one here, pro-con article, it's noted for you. You can also sort of use these filters. But these are the pro-con articles. I usually let my students know you should start with first, because this gives you a full picture of what's being discussed. And what I like too, again, at the bottom, it gives you keywords that you can use, and it also gives you a bibliography of other sources that you can explore and you can visit if you want to learn more about the topic or you want to reference any of the source material that they've used. And again, you've got your citations here. You've got the ability to share, that kind of thing. Okay. Opposing viewpoints is another great one. And what I like about opposing viewpoints, let me know if you're not seeing this on the screen as we go, by the way. I haven't seen anybody say that. But what I like about opposing viewpoints, and if you have a topic you want me to explore, please throw it in the chat. A lot of my students are doing minimum wage. Some of my students are in here, but are doing minimum wage. What I like is that this kind of breaks it up. This particular source has academic journals on this right side. We've got some viewpoint or opinion pieces on this side, some featured ones that they think are particularly useful here. But it's also got other sources, like reference sources, like Wikipedia style sources, infographics that could be useful, images that could be useful, videos that could be useful, podcasts and audio that you might want to listen to, especially, I mean, you can bring those into papers. So there's no problem there. Videos, websites, stats, all those kinds of things. So I like that it kind of breaks it up in this particular way with Gale. It's really useful in that particular respect. Okay, but another really useful source, and this is the one that most folks end up going to first, is Academic Search Complete. So Academic Search Complete, standard search engine, standard database that you might have used in high school or in previous classes. These search bars, you want to be using keywords. You can either use them with the search bars here, and you can use these Booleans to either separate words. If you do not, it's not going to include things with that. If you do or, it's going to search either or of those things, and it's going to search all of the materials there. You can also use commas to signify and. Let's see, minimum wage Hawaii there, 2 keywords. Yeah, I'll just use that. Okay. Using your keywords are helpful here. Don't type in full sentences, because if you type in full sentences, all of the words in that sentence are going to be, it's going to return results for all of the words in those sentences that are there. Okay, so you kind of look through here. You can see if there's sources. 12 is pretty good. That's actually a pretty good amount to kind of sift through. And that's why those keywords can be particularly useful. You notice if I didn't add that qualifier of Hawaii, I've got 7,000 to look through. And that's not a really helpful amount of sources to look through. You're gonna need a lot of time to look through that. So there are some things we can do. One is to add qualifiers like Hawaii if you're dealing with the state or federal. And you see just adding federal there, that brought it down to 1,300. That's pretty good. but I still wouldn't expect you to sift through 1,000 sources before you find sources that you want. So what we can do is we can use these limits on the left-hand side. These are really important. So the first limit, I would suggest that you select this full text. And that's because this helps to ensure that when you find a source that might be useful, you can actually access it. Sometimes if you don't click on that, the database finds it, but when you actually click into it, you might not have access to it for a number of reasons that are there, okay? You can also click on references available or peer reviewed. Takes it down considerably when we type peer reviewed, right? And again, peer reviewed right there, that already takes care of some of the legwork of trying to figure out if this thing is credible. We know it's credible, it's been peer reviewed in that particular respect. You've also got this little date range here. And we said, you know, Jamie said 6 years, so we'll do 6 years. That's like 2015. Oh, well, no, 2016. No, 2015. No, sorry, 2022. Okay, we limit that down, and we brought it down to 112, right? So it's a little bit more reasonable in that particular respect. You'll notice that some of these sources are already just kind of reading some of them. They might not be the most credible or most relevant to our particular topic, but we'll kind of deal with that afterwards. What you can do too, you can limit it by source type. I also like the source term tool, because what it does is it gives you can select the different keywords you want to limit it to. But I also like to use this for adding to my keyword bank, because this might give me some keywords that I want to research further that I haven't researched into. So this kind of works in that particular respect, even though that's not really the function of it. It's functioning there so that you can, you know, bring that source count down to, you know, a more reasonable source count of 21. Okay, so let's see if there's any sources here that might be useful. Some weird sources in here. Okay, let's play with our keywords a little bit. Add United States instead of federal. Okay, so here we get, you know, some more relevant sources off the bat just by changing that particular keyword there. Okay, let's say we're going through here and maybe we decide we want to look at this particular source. Some things that you'll notice when you click on a source that could be potentially useful for you is you'll notice it's got this abstract. And this helps to give you a sense of what the source might be about. So definitely, before accessing the source, read it. Is it relevant to what you're actually doing for your paper? If it's not, you can start to move on to other sources. Maybe it seems like it after reading it. And if it is, you can click the full text there. And you have the PDF accessible to you. Here, go ahead and read it, annotate it, those kinds of things. Using Academic Search Complete, another great thing about it, you can email it to yourself if you don't have enough time. Maybe you only got an hour. You're trying to find a couple of sources. You don't really want to get into these sources just yet. So you can email them to yourself. You can save them. I think this is, saves it to a folder in the library. You can also export it to your computer. You've got that citation tool there, just like you had with Credo and the other ones we looked at. And you can also save it to your Google Drive if you want to save it to your Google Drive. Okay, so that's useful for you. Trying to make the most of your goodness. There you go. Okay, and so the last tool I'm going to talk about is this search bar. So this search bar that's on the main page, it could be a good tool too. But the thing with this search bar is it really searches everything in the library, databases, books, everything that's out there. And that can be really useful, but it can also return a lot of sources. And of course, you can also play with this here. And so that can, do I want it articles? Do I want a library catalog? Do I want print books? So you can limit it there. You can also use this material type tool here on the left-hand side. What kind of sources do you want? You can also hit availability and click available online. And this can ensure that you don't think you'll have enough time to go to the library itself. So that can ensure you can actually access it online. You'll also note you can click peer-reviewed journals too to help limit it there. But the great thing about using this is, say I do find a source that's actually in the library, because you might have a professor that tells you, let's clear these filters. that tells you, in addition to online sources, I want you to also have one book source, right? You might run into that particular situation. You're like, I got to go down to the library, right? And it's like, man, I got to go to work. I've got to do all these kinds of things. I don't have enough time to go through the library and sort of go into the stacks and find it. Now, of course, if you go to the library, a reference librarian can certainly help you to find that material and make that process a lot easier. But one of my favorite tools when you're trying to find a print source that's available through the library is the Get It tool. And so when you find a source you like this might be an interesting source for you. And here you can see it's held at the Leeward CC library. It's also held at all of the libraries. Click that, ask you to sign in. Hopefully it's somewhere, yeah, there we go, I'm already signed in. And you'll notice once you sign in, you can request a copy. And what you can do is you can decide what institution you want to pick it up at. So maybe you are a Leeward Community College student, but maybe you live in Waianae, right, as a lot of students do. Or maybe you live Windward-side or Haleiwa or something like that, right? And you want to be able to get this source. Maybe you live in Haleiwa and you work in town. And on your drive to town, you pass through Kaneohe. And so it's easier for you to get to Windward Community College than it is for you to get to Leeward Community College. Or maybe it's easier to get to Leeward Community College than Windward Community College, whatever it might be. You can select the easiest location for you. And if it's available, the institution will tell you. If not, it'll automatically select it like this. Send your request. And then in a couple of days, the library will email you, hey, your book is ready for pickup. You can just drive on in, 2 minutes, get out of your car, go over to the library. Most of the libraries have these things set up on the outside. Punch in your code or show your ID and you've got your book. 5 minutes, you don't have to go into the library at all. You don't have to go into the stacks, it's already done for you. Most of the legwork taken care of. The other nice thing about the library website is, again, maybe you need some help with your research. You've reached out to your professor and you're waiting to hear back from them. And you're like, I really need to find a source. This paper is due tonight. You can use this chat with a librarian feature. And if it's during library hours, this will connect to a librarian pretty quickly. It usually does anyway. It's lunchtime though, so I'm not sure if it will. In most cases, when I do this live thing, it does work, but it might take a minute. But yeah, there we go. So you can actually talk with the librarian. And so if you're having trouble with your research, you need help with something, you can ask the librarian, the reference librarian right there, and they can help to direct you to any sources or material or help you with your works cited entries, your APA citations, those kinds of things for you. Okay. All right, so that's the library resources. And so the last thing that I'm going to talk about is plagiarism. We've only got about 5 minutes, so we're going to move through this quite quickly. So you want to make sure that once you find your sources, you're properly representing them, of course. If you need help with your references, you can use Purdue OWL. Do a quick Google search, Purdue OWL. They have APA, Chicago, and MLA. You can chat with the librarian. You can, of course, ask your professor for help with that. But it is important. The main reason why we're doing this is to, one, again, to build believability in our sources, but two, to help us avoid plagiarism. And so it's important, things that need to be cited in your paper, specific ideas, content, information that you've pulled from your sources. If you wouldn't consider it common knowledge, general information, stuff that most people would probably know, it needs to be cited. If you got it from a source, it needs to be cited. And when we're talking about citing, it needs an in-text citation. So if you're paraphrasing immediately after the paraphrase, whether that's a few sentences or one sentence, you would have a citation at the end. That's typically the author's last name or the title of the source. If you're an APA, it's going to have the date after that. If you're an MLA, either the page number or the paragraph number, if that's available. And it also needs a works cited or a references citation as well. Those two things work together. You need to have the citation in your works cited page or your reference, because that's what is used to link the in-text citation to it, okay? But some things that are considered plagiarism, if you're not sure, some things that you want to make sure you're avoiding. One is to make sure that you're not submitting material to your courses that's been copied without properly quoting or identifying the source. So again, if you took exact language from a source, you're making sure to use quotation marks around that exact language, including your citations. If you're paraphrasing, so taking ideas from a source, rewording that in your own language, That's not your own ideas, that's from someone else. So even though you've rewritten it into your own language, it's got to have a citation at the end. It's got to have a works cited or an a reference at the end as well too. Okay, so you got to make sure you're having that. It's also helpful if you have a signal phrase, according to, source, and then you continue, you have your quote or you have your paraphrase. And my apologies, I'm going through this quickly because we only have 4 minutes. And the last thing, or not last thing, I'm sorry, make sure paraphrasing without citation and acknowledgement, I've already said that, not including a works cited or a reference page, or not including a works cited entry or a reference. If you've used it in your source, it should have both. You submit a research paper without a works cited page or a reference page or without including that, it's plagiarism. Okay, even if you've got the quotation marks in your paper, it's still plagiarism because you can't verify the information. So you've got to make sure you've got that works cited or that reference page as well too. Submitting the same material to different courses. Maybe you took English 100 last semester, you're doing a similar topic for English 200 this semester. You cannot use that paper from English 100 for English 200. That is plagiarism, and that is a violation of the academic integrity that the university sets forward. Also, dry labbing. This is something that oftentimes happens in science classes, computer science classes. You can't make up data, that's plagiarism. You can't pull, like if you're doing coding, for example, you can't pull strings of code from the internet, work that into your own coding. That is plagiarism. That is not your ideas. You cannot represent them as your own. So you want to make sure you're also avoiding that. The key takeaway here, if you found it somewhere else, make sure you properly represented it as those individuals' ideas rather than your own ideas. And of course, if you have any questions about this, the library actually, let's go there real quick before as we conclude here. And as I'm getting to this particular section, note that the evaluation section is over in the, or the evaluation link is in the chat. So make sure you fill that out, especially if you want to get extra credit. If you're one of my students, you don't have to worry about that because I've already noted that you're in my class. So you're good in that particular respect. Okay. All right. Pause my share. There we go. Oh yeah. So should be sharing now, right? Yeah, okay, good. Up here in the information literacy exam, if you go to the English 100 tutorial, and if you're an English 100 student or you were an English 100 student, you already took this, but you notice you go to the citation section here. It also covers this information too, with some examples for you. Okay. Any questions? Sorry, that last section was like, we had to get that done quickly. And although we're done, you're welcome to hang out. I'll answer any questions that you have. Tasha, maybe you want to stop the recording though. And then if you do have any questions, I'll